The morning began like any other, with the pale light of dawn seeping through half-closed blinds. I woke up before him as I always did. The soft hum of the kettle, the quiet pop of the toaster, the familiar rhythm of coffee being stirred. Each sound a note in the symphony of our routine. Every movement had its place, every gesture its purpose. Our life had become a choreography of predictability, a comfort that wrapped around me like a well-worn blanket, and yet, it smothered me too. He stepped into the kitchen already dressed for work. His suit, a muted gray, his tie perfectly knotted, every hair in place. His presence filled the room with a sense of order, like a freshly made bed, crisp and untouched. He leaned in and kissed my forehead, a practiced move that neither asked nor gave anything. It wasn't a lack of love, it was a lack of newness. We had become actors, endlessly rehearsing the same lines, the same scenes without variation. "Will you be home late tonight?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, eyes on his phone. "Yeah, meetings back to back. Don't wait up." And just like that he was gone, leaving behind the scent of his aftershave and a kitchen filled with echoes. I stood there, the toast cooling on my plate, the coffee turning lukewarm. The quiet settled around me, a second skin that I wore without complaint. I moved through the house, straightening pillows, folding laundry, running my fingers along the surfaces to check for dust. It was a dance I knew well, the steps of a life built on stability and small certainties. I had chosen this life. I had wanted it, hadn't I? But then there was the conversation. His voice, drifting through the crack of a door left ajar, talking to a colleague. The words landed with a dull thud in my chest. "Yeah, everything's fine. You know how it is. Our marriage is steady. Safe. There's no spark, but maybe that's normal." A spark. He had said it so casually, like describing the weather. But it was enough to ignite something in me. A slow burn of realization. I sat down on the edge of our bed, feeling the weight of the years we had spent together pressing down on me. My reflection in the mirror stared back, calm and composed, but beneath that surface was a fault line, trembling. I opened the drawer of the nightstand, where a small, unopened box lay nestled between old receipts and a half-used bottle of lavender lotion. Lingerie, delicate lace in a soft blush color. I had bought it weeks ago, hoping to reignite something, to pull him back into the warmth of our shared bed. But the box remained untouched, a quiet reminder of intentions unfulfilled. Outside, the street was coming to life. I caught a glimpse of him through the window, the neighbor. He was walking his dog, his stride easy, the leash loose in his hand. He was the kind of man who always had a smile ready, whose presence felt like an open door. We had exchanged pleasantries before, the kind of small talk that floats on the surface of daily life, light and inconsequential. But now, as I watched him, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. His eyes met mine and he waved, the gesture so casual, yet it sent a ripple through the stillness of my morning. I raised my hand in response, a reflex, and held his gaze a moment longer than I should have. There was nothing in that look. Nothing overt, nothing spoken. But it was as if a thread had been pulled, unraveling the tight weave of my life. I turned away, forcing myself back into the rhythm of chores and quiet tasks. But the echo of his wave lingered, a small disruption in the seamless flow of my day. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like a song you hear only a fragment of but can't stop humming. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I felt the space between us grow. It was not physical. Our bodies were just inches apart. But a chasm had opened, a distance filled with everything unspoken. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind wandered back to that moment by the window, to the warmth of the sun and the unexpected stir in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. Just a passing thought, a harmless moment. But deep down I knew that something had shifted. A door had been left slightly ajar, and all it would take was the smallest push to open it wider. And somewhere in the quiet, beneath the layers of routine and safety, I felt a spark. The rain came suddenly, a downpour that soaked the world in minutes. I had only planned to run a quick errand, a trip to the market for fresh bread and a few vegetables. The sky had been a dull gray, but nothing about it had suggested the storm waiting to break. Now, drenched to the skin, I hurried down the street, clutching the thin paper bag to my chest, the edges beginning to dissolve under the weight of water. The house was still half a block away when I saw him. He was coming from the opposite direction, his jacket pulled over his head as a makeshift umbrella. Even through the curtain of rain, his smile was unmistakable. To cut through the gray, a bright line that led straight to me. Need a hand? His voice was warm, the kind of warmth that wraps around you on a cold day. I didn't answer, just nodded, my breath catching somewhere between relief and something I couldn't quite name. He took the bag from my arms, his fingers brushing mine, and I felt it again. That spark, a pulse of heat in the chill of the storm. We walked the rest of the way in silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of rain on concrete. I focused on the details. The way water clung to his eyelashes, the curve of his mouth as he squinted against the wet. Small things, but they filled the quiet between us, layering meaning over the mundane. When we reached the door, I fumbled for my keys, the metal slipping against my damp fingers. He stood close, the bag balanced on his hip, the closeness of him a weight I could feel without touch. The door finally gave way and I stepped inside, turning to take the groceries. But he didn't let go. His hand was still wrapped around the bag, his knuckles pale against the wet paper. His face was so close I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the tiny flecks of gold in his irises. For a moment the world outside faded, the rain a distant hum, the house a hollow shell. There was only him, the breath between us, the unspoken words filling the space. Then he leaned in. It was not a question, not a test. It was a truth, a moment that had been waiting to happen. His lips met mine, soft and uncertain, and the world tilted. I felt the cool press of rain against my skin, the warmth of his mouth, the sharp edge of the doorframe digging into my back. It was everything and nothing all at once. A collision, a revelation. The kiss lasted a heartbeat, maybe two, but in that brief touch I felt the weight of every choice I had made. When he pulled back, his face was a mixture of surprise and something darker, a question he didn't ask. I couldn't find the words, my voice trapped beneath the rush of my pulse. "You should get inside," he said finally, his voice rough. "Before you catch a cold." I nodded, stepping back over the threshold, my feet heavy. He handed me the bag, his fingers brushing mine one last time. Then he turned, his silhouette fading into the rain, leaving only the echo of his touch and the taste of his kiss lingering on my lips. I closed the door, the wood cool against my back as I slid to the floor. The groceries lay forgotten beside me, the paper soaked through, vegetables spilling out like secrets. My mind replayed the moment on a loop, each frame sharper than the last. His lips, the rain, the way his voice had softened at the end. I pressed my fingers to my mouth, feeling the ghost of him still there. The house around me was silent, the kind of silence that hums with possibilities. I could still feel the dampness of my clothes, the cold seeping into my skin, but inside a fire had caught hold. I wanted to dismiss it, to fold the moment neatly away, but it refused. It burned, a small flame against the shadows, a reminder that something had changed. For the rest of the day I moved through the house like a ghost, my body present but my mind elsewhere. I washed the dishes, folded laundry, wiped down countertops, all the while feeling the pull of him, a thread that tied me to a moment I couldn't let go. Every time I closed my eyes I saw him. The rain, the way his mouth had felt against mine, the softness of his whisper. When night fell I stood at the window watching the street. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the pavement dark and wet, reflecting the orange glow of streetlights. His house sat across the way, windows dark, curtains drawn. I waited for a sign, a light, a shadow, anything to tell me I wasn't alone in this. But nothing moved, the world holding its breath, waiting. And somewhere deep inside I felt it too. The inhale before the plunge, the moment of suspension before everything changed. The days that followed were a blur of routines and half-finished thoughts. I moved through life as if underwater, every motion slowed, every sound muffled. My husband's voice drifted around me, soft and distant, like a melody I couldn't quite catch. I nodded at the right moments, offered smiles when needed, all the while my mind lingered in the doorway under the rain, where a kiss had rewritten the story I thought I knew. I found myself inventing reasons to be outside. A sudden need to water the garden, to fetch the mail, to check on a plant that hadn't needed checking in months. Each step across the lawn was both a promise and a dare. Sometimes he would be there, a casual wave, a brief meeting of eyes that spoke more than either of us dared to say. Other times his absence would settle over me like a damp cloth, heavy and suffocating. It was during one of those quiet mornings that we saw each other again. The neighborhood had organized a small gathering, a community project to clean up the local park. I hadn't planned to go, but when I heard his name mentioned, a seed of curiosity took root. I dressed with more care than the occasion required, choosing a dress that draped softly, its fabric catching the breeze. Nothing overt but enough to make me feel seen. When I arrived, he was already there, surrounded by a cluster of neighbors. He moved with an easy grace, a bag of mulch slung over his shoulder, the sun catching in his hair. I busied myself with planting flowers, my hands deep in the cool earth, but I felt him before I saw him. His shadow stretched across the ground, mingling with mine, and then he was beside me. "Need a hand?" His voice was a gentle nudge, a reminder of the space we had once shared. I nodded, my own voice caught in my throat. He knelt beside me, our shoulders brushing as we worked in silence. His presence was a current, pulling me in, and I had to concentrate on each breath, each movement, to keep myself from drifting too close. Around us, the world continued. Laughter, the scrape of tools against dirt, the rustle of leaves. But in the bubble of our closeness, everything else faded. I could smell the grass, the tang of soil, but beneath it all was him, a scent I had begun to memorize. Every accidental touch sent a jolt through me, a reminder of the boundaries we were tiptoeing along. His fingers brushed mine as we passed tools, his knee pressed against my leg as he shifted his weight. Small moments, tiny collisions, but each one built upon the last, a tower of unspoken truths. When the event wrapped up, the group gathered for a final photo. We stood on opposite ends, the gap between us a reminder of the lines we had drawn. I felt his gaze even as I looked forward, the weight of it like a hand against my skin. The camera flashed, and for a second, everything was suspended, the world captured in stillness, our secrets hidden in plain sight. As people began to disperse, he lingered. I moved to the edge of the park where the trees grew thicker, offering shade and shadows. He followed, his footsteps soft against the grass. When he reached me, we stood in silence, the space between us charged, a wire pulled taut. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice low, meant only for me. "I didn't think I would either." My reply was quiet, barely a breath. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray leaf from my hair. The gesture was gentle, almost innocent, but the touch lingered, his fingers grazing my temple, the curve of my cheek. I closed my eyes, the world narrowing to the warmth of his skin against mine. The silence between us was full, a tide pulling us forward. I wanted to step into it, to let it wash over me, but fear held me back. Fear of what lay on the other side, of what might break if we moved too fast, too far. When he finally stepped back, the absence of him was a physical ache. His hand fell to his side, fingers curling into a fist as if he too was fighting the pull. "We should go," he said, and his voice held a rough edge, a crack in the calm. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We walked back to the others, side by side but miles apart. Every step was a retreat, a slow unwinding of the thread that had bound us in those shadows. By the time we reached the open, we were just two neighbors again, part of the crowd, our closeness folded away beneath layers of routine. But as I climbed into my car, my hands trembling against the wheel, I caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. He stood at the edge of the park, watching, his figure framed by the trees. And I knew, with a certainty that left me breathless, that this story was far from over. The next chapter waited, just beyond the bend, where the shadows lingered, and the spark had only just begun to catch fire. The rest of the week stretched out in a series of carefully managed silences. My husband's absence had become a constant, not just physically but emotionally. He moved through our home like a shadow, present but never fully there. His work, his routines, his meticulous adherence to schedules, all of it created a wall between us, one that I had once accepted as part of marriage but now felt like a prison. I couldn't stop thinking about the park, about the closeness of him, the brush of his fingers against my skin. Each memory replayed in my mind, vivid and consuming. It was like a secret movie only I could watch, each scene a reminder of the thin line we walked. I found myself craving those small moments, the brief touches, the weight of his gaze. The realization came slowly, creeping up on me. This wasn't just a passing infatuation. It was more, a need that wound through me, tight and unyielding. One afternoon as I stood by the window, I saw him again. He was walking down the street, his steps measured, his shoulders set with that easy confidence I had come to recognize. He glanced up, his eyes catching mine through the glass. He didn't wave this time, but the connection sparked nonetheless, a current between us. I pulled back, the curtain slipping from my fingers, the thin fabric a barrier that did nothing to block out the pull I felt. The opportunity presented itself as a simple text. His message appeared on my phone, innocuous and perfectly framed, "Having trouble with my computer. Can you help?" There were a dozen logical reasons for him to ask. Our earlier conversations about technology, my casual mention of working from home, but the undertone was clear. He was reaching out, a hand extended into the quiet of my life, offering a chance to break the surface. My response was equally simple. Of course. When? His reply came quickly, a time set for the afternoon. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, the decision already made. When I arrived at his door, the air between us was thick with the weight of our choices. He opened it, his face open and unguarded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. The house was warm, a stark contrast to the cool autumn air outside. I stepped inside, my body brushing past his, the space around us narrowing. He led me to the living room where a laptop sat open on the coffee table. The screen displayed a frozen image, a harmless problem that could have been solved with a phone call. But he had chosen to bring me here into his space, where the boundaries blurred and the rules we had set began to fray. I knelt beside the laptop, my hands moving over the keys, my mind barely processing the task. He sat next to me, close enough that his knee pressed against my leg. His presence was a constant hum, a steady beat against the rush of my thoughts. I felt his breath, the soft exhale as he watched me, and I knew he was not looking at the screen. He was looking at me, seeing the way my fingers trembled, the way my shoulders tightened under his gaze. The problem on the laptop was a simple one, a setting that needed adjusting, a button to be pressed. I fixed it quickly, my hands moving automatically, but when I turned to tell him, his face was already close, too close. His eyes searched mine, a question hanging in the air between us, fragile and dangerous. Before I could speak, his hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His fingers lingered, tracing the curve of my cheek, and I felt the world shrink to the point of contact. It was not a bold move, not a leap, but a step, small and deliberate. His touch was a promise, a path forward, and all I had to do was follow. My own hand rose, my fingers finding his wrist, holding him there, suspended in the moment. The room around us faded, the walls a blur, the quiet a cocoon. His face tilted, his lips a breath away, and then the space between us disappeared. The kiss was gentle, unhurried. His mouth moved against mine, soft and exploring, as if he were giving me time to pull away, to stop this before it began. But I didn't. I leaned into it, my hand slipping to the back of his neck, drawing him closer. His response was immediate, the kiss deepening, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me into the warmth of him. When we broke apart, the room seemed to hold its breath. His forehead rested against mine, our breathing synchronized, a rhythm only we could hear. I felt the edge of his pulse against my skin, a reminder that this was real, that we had crossed the line from thought to action. "I fixed the computer," I whispered, a smile tugging at my lips. He chuckled, a soft sound that filled the space between us. "Yeah, you did." We sat there for a moment longer, the reality of what had happened settling over us like a blanket. There was no guilt, not yet. Only the warmth of his arms, the steady beat of his heart, and the unspoken promise that this was only the beginning. The days began to blend into each other, each one threaded with a new kind of tension. My life became a careful balance of moments, those spent with my husband, wrapped in the quiet monotony of our routine, and those fleeting encounters with him, where every glance and every touch felt like stepping into an electric current. I was living in two worlds, each one pulling at me, stretching me thin but keeping me suspended in a state of anticipation. At home, nothing seemed to change. My husband remained wrapped up in his work, his phone calls bleeding into dinner, his emails stretching late into the night. He would brush his lips against my cheek before bed, a gesture of affection that barely grazed the surface. I began to wonder if he noticed the shift in me, the way my breath hitched when my phone buzzed, the sudden brightness in my eyes when I returned from my so-called errands. But if he did, he never said a word. Our stolen moments became the only time I felt fully awake. We found ways to be close without drawing attention. A shared glance over the garden fence, his hand brushing mine as he passed me a tool, the quiet rush of his breath when he leaned in just a little too close. Each encounter was a piece of a story we were writing in the margins of our lives. One evening, the neighborhood held a small gathering. A barbecue in the park, children running through the grass, the smell of smoke and grilled food heavy in the air. I went alone, my husband caught up in a last-minute meeting. He was there, of course. Our eyes met across the crowd, a spark that bridged the space between us. I could feel him even from a distance, his presence a magnetic pull that set my skin alight. I moved through the motions, polite conversations, shared laughter, the practiced ease of being part of a community. But every step brought me closer to him. We circled each other, careful and deliberate, until finally we found ourselves alone. A moment carved out of the chaos, hidden beneath the canopy of an old tree. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low, just for me. A shiver ran through me, not from the cool evening air but from the weight of his words. "Thank you." My voice came out softer than I intended, a whisper that carried the truth of everything unspoken. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was so light, so careful, but it was enough to unravel me. I leaned into him, the space between us vanishing as he pulled me into the shadows. His lips found mine, a kiss that was both a question and an answer. It was different this time, no hesitation, no room for doubt. His hands moved to my waist, holding me steady as the world around us blurred. We broke apart only when a burst of laughter from the crowd brought us back to reality. I stepped back, the cool bark of the tree pressing into my back, grounding me. His hand slipped from my waist, but his touch lingered, a warmth that stayed even as he stepped into the light, rejoining the party. I followed a few minutes later, my heart still racing, the taste of him still on my lips. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I moved through conversations, my responses automatic, my mind replaying every moment under that tree. I could see him across the lawn, surrounded by neighbors, his face a perfect mask of normalcy. But when he caught my eye, his expression softened, a promise in the curve of his smile. When I returned home, my husband was still in his office. The blue light of his computer screen cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more worn. He looked up when I entered, his eyes glassy from hours spent staring at spreadsheets. "Hey," he said, his voice thick with fatigue. "How was it?" I paused, the lie already on my tongue. "Good. Nice to see everyone." He nodded, his attention already drifting back to his screen. I stood in the doorway, the weight of the evening settling over me. I wanted to reach out to him to bridge the gap between us, but my feet remained planted, my hands at my sides. The distance felt insurmountable, a chasm carved by years of neglect, both his and mine. I turned away, moving through the house on autopilot. My skin still tingled where his hands had been, the memory of his kiss a ghost that followed me through the dark. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the room filled with the soft hum of the heater and the even rhythm of my husband's breathing. I felt both full and hollow, a paradox of desire and guilt that twisted tight in my chest. Sleep came slowly, dragging me under in waves. I dreamed of him, not of his face but of the feeling of his hands on my skin, the warmth of his breath against my neck. I woke before dawn, the world still wrapped in shadow, my body aching with a longing I couldn't shake. I sat up, the sheets pooling around my waist, my hands pressed to my chest as if I could hold my heart together. I knew then, with a clarity that cut through the fog, that this was no longer just a moment, a slip of control. It was a choice, a path I was walking with my eyes wide open. And with every step I was moving further from the life I had built, into the dark, into the unknown. The days that followed slipped by in a haze, each one a repetition of the last. I moved through my life as if on autopilot, my actions mechanical, my thoughts somewhere else entirely. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a stage where I played my part with practiced ease. My husband remained in his orbit, his world a series of meetings and deadlines, while mine had shrunk to the brief, stolen moments when I could feel alive. I started to notice the small things that had always been there but had never stood out before. The way his phone never left his hand, the endless hum of his laptop, the way his answers to my questions had become reflexive, devoid of real thought. He would ask about my day, his eyes already on his screen, and my answers became stories I crafted to fill the silence. I told him about errands I never ran, about friends I hadn't seen in months. And he nodded, accepted each tale, the truth slipping past him like water through fingers. But beneath the surface, my reality had shifted. Each message from him was a jolt, a reminder of the world I had begun to create outside the walls of my marriage. Our conversations were coded, our plans woven into the fabric of everyday life. He would text me in the early afternoon, his words carefully chosen, and I would respond, my fingers flying over the keyboard, my pulse quickening with every ping. We became experts at finding moments where none existed. He would walk his dog in the late afternoon and I would find myself on the porch, a book in my lap, my attention anywhere but the pages. His path would loop close to my house, our eyes meeting in a shared secret. Sometimes he would stop, his hand brushing over the dog's fur, his voice carrying just far enough for me to hear. "Nice day, isn't it?" I would nod, my own response layered with meaning. "Yes, beautiful." These exchanges were nothing to the outside world, a casual conversation between neighbors, but for us they were everything. Each word was a promise, each glance a brushstroke in a painting only we could see. The line between what was real and what was imagined blurred, and I found myself living in the in-between, where possibilities lived and the constraints of my reality faded. One morning as I was folding laundry, his message appeared on my phone. "Can you come over? I need to talk." The request was simple, but the undercurrent ran deep. I hesitated, the pile of clothes in my lap a reminder of the life I was stepping away from. But the pull was too strong, the need to see him, to feel the warmth of his presence, overwhelming. I found myself at his door, my hand raised to knock, the sound echoing through the quiet. He opened it almost immediately, his face a mix of relief and something else. Something darker. He stepped aside, letting me in, the door closing behind me with a soft click. His house was neat, the kind of order that spoke of someone who spent a lot of time alone. The room was filled with soft light, the afternoon sun filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. We stood in the hallway, the space between us a taut wire ready to snap. His hand found mine, his fingers slipping through mine, and I felt the weight of every choice I had made. His skin was warm, the press of his palm against mine a reminder of the line we had crossed. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I couldn't find my own words, my throat tight. Instead, I moved closer, closing the distance between us. His arms came around me, pulling me against him, his face buried in my hair. I felt the rise and fall of his chest, the steady thrum of his heartbeat, and for a moment I let myself sink into it, let the rest of the world fall away. We sat on the edge of the couch, our legs tangled together, his hands tracing patterns along my back. He didn't speak and neither did I. The silence wrapped around us, a blanket that held us in place, safe and separate from everything outside. His fingers moved to my face, his thumb brushing over my cheek, a touch so soft it felt like a dream. The rest of the afternoon slipped by, marked only by the slow drift of shadows across the room. When it was time to go, he held me a moment longer, his face pressed to the curve of my neck. I felt the press of his lips, a kiss hidden from the world, a mark that only I would carry. When I stepped back outside, the sky had begun to darken, the first hints of evening creeping into the edges of the day. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a reminder of the life waiting for me at home. I took a breath, the air sharp and cool, and began to walk. Each step was a return to reality, the weight of my choices settling back onto my shoulders, but beneath it all, a warmth remained, a reminder that the story I was living had only just begun. The weekend arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind that soaked the world in a quiet melancholy. My husband had suggested a trip, a spontaneous getaway to a small cottage by the lake. He framed it as a chance to reconnect, to break away from the monotony of our lives. His words were sincere, his intentions clear, but I couldn't shake the sense of being caught in a play, reciting lines from a script I had grown tired of. I agreed, of course. What else could I do? There was no reason not to go, no excuse strong enough to hold back the truth of my reluctance. We packed our bags in silence, the space between us filled with everything we had never said. His eyes held a softness, a hope that perhaps this weekend could stitch up the seams that had started to fray. I tried to mirror it, to reflect back what he needed to see, but my own hope was dulled, a worn thread barely holding. As we loaded the car, I saw him. He was standing by his window, his figure a shadow against the glass. Our eyes met, a fleeting connection that buzzed in the air like a live wire. I couldn't move, my hand frozen on the handle of my suitcase. My husband's voice broke the spell, his words a distant murmur as he asked if I was ready. I turned away, my chest tight, and climbed into the car. The drive was long, the rain a constant patter against the windows. My husband talked about work, about plans for the house, about nothing at all. His words drifted over me, a tide I floated on without truly hearing. My thoughts slipped through my fingers, tangled up in the memory of him, of the warmth of his hands, the weight of his gaze. I felt the echo of his touch, the brush of his lips, the way his presence had filled every empty space inside me. The cottage was small and quaint, nestled against the lake's edge. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where the world outside felt far away. My husband took my hand as we walked inside, his fingers warm but unfamiliar. I squeezed back, a reflex more than a response, and forced a smile when he looked at me, his eyes searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. We unpacked slowly, every movement measured, as if we were easing into a role we had forgotten. The rain drummed on the roof, a soft rhythm that filled the silence between us. He suggested a walk and I nodded, slipping into my jacket, the cool air biting at my skin as we stepped outside. The lake stretched out before us, a mirror of silver and gray. The path wound through the trees, the ground soft underfoot. My husband reached for my hand, his grip firm, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. I focused on the sensation, trying to pull myself into the moment, to find the thread that might lead us back to each other. "I miss this," he said, his voice breaking through the quiet. "Just being with you." I glanced at him, the sincerity in his expression a gentle ache. "I miss it too," I whispered, and it was not entirely a lie. I missed the idea of it, the version of us that had existed before life had worn us down. But the truth lay in the hollow space between us, in the shadow of another man whose absence was a weight I could not shake. We returned to the cottage, our clothes damp, our cheeks flushed from the cold. He made a fire, the flames casting long shadows against the wooden walls. We sat together on the couch, a blanket draped over our legs, and for a moment, I allowed myself to lean into him, to let his arm around my shoulders hold me up. When he kissed me, it was gentle, a question more than a demand. His lips moved against mine, soft and familiar, but I felt the distance, the way my body did not respond the way it should. I kissed him back, my hands curling into his shirt, and he sighed against my mouth, a sound of relief, of gratitude. But beneath it all, I felt a pull, a tether to another place, another touch. We moved through the motions, the practiced dance of intimacy that had once been enough. His hands traced familiar paths, his breath warm against my skin, but my mind drifted, pulled by the memory of a different warmth, a different fire. I closed my eyes, willing myself to be present, to find the spark that had once burned so brightly between us. When it was over, he held me, his arms tight around me, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against my back. I stared into the dim light, the fire reduced to embers, and felt the weight of my choices settle over me. I had given him what he needed, but it had cost me more than I could afford. The truth lay heavy on my tongue, a secret that tasted of ash. The weekend ended and we drove home in silence. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, clouds pressing low against the horizon. I watched the road blur past, my reflection in the window a ghost of the woman I had been. My husband's hand rested on my knee, his thumb moving in slow circles, a gesture of comfort that only deepened the ache inside me. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned to me, his face open and hopeful. "I think this helped," he said. "I feel closer to you." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Me too." But as I stepped out of the car, my eyes found the house across the street, its windows dark, its door closed. The truth twisted inside me, sharp and unyielding, and I knew that the distance between where I was and where I wanted to be had only grown wider. Returning home felt like stepping back into a story where the pages had been left blank. The echoes of our weekend lingered in the air, my husband's soft smiles, the way he reached for my hand more often, the hopeful glances that lingered a moment too long. He moved through the house with a renewed energy, as if he had found a missing piece, a thread that might sew us back together. But I remained untethered, adrift in a world that felt borrowed. Each step I took inside our home felt wrong, the weight of my choices pressing against my chest. I moved through the motions, laundry, dinner, casual conversations, but my mind remained elsewhere, caught in the space between what was real and what I had allowed myself to imagine. The first message came late at night. My phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, its screen a sliver of light in the darkened room. My husband was already asleep, his breathing deep and even. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cool glass. His name appeared, a small bubble of text that pulled me from the edge of sleep. "Are you home?" A simple question, but beneath it, a current. I hesitated, the shadows of the room pressing in around me. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, my mind racing. I could ignore it, close the door to whatever it was we had started, but the thought left a hollow ache in my chest. Yes, I replied, the words stark against the pale light. His response came quickly, as if he had been waiting. Can we talk? I glanced at my husband, his silhouette soft against the pillows. I slipped from the bed, the floor cool beneath my feet, and moved to the hallway. The quiet of the house wrapped around me, a blanket of stillness. I leaned against the wall, my pulse a drumbeat in the silence. What's wrong? I typed, my breath shallow. There was a pause, a stretch of seconds that felt like hours. Then, I can't stop thinking about you. The truth in his words struck me, a sharp edge against my skin. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it settle over me. I wanted to respond, to reach back across the distance, but the reality of my life sat heavy in my throat. I could hear my husband's breathing, the soft rustle of sheets, a reminder of the promises I had made. I know, I typed. Me too. The conversation slipped into the early hours, our words a thread that pulled me further from sleep and deeper into the world we had created. He told me about his day, about the way he had caught glimpses of me from his window, how he had watched as I moved through my routines, longing to reach out. I shared my own thoughts, the way the weekend had felt like a dream, a break in the fog of my life. As the sky began to lighten, our messages slowed, the quiet settling back in. I stared at the last words on my screen, his final message a whisper of what we could not say out loud. I need to see you. The following day I moved through the hours with a sense of inevitability. I made coffee, answered emails, folded clothes. All the while my mind raced with the possibilities of how and when. My husband left for work with a kiss on my cheek, a lingering touch that sent a shiver through me, not of warmth but of distance. I watched him go, the door closing with a soft click, and the house fell into silence. It didn't take long for him to appear. I had barely set my coffee cup down when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find him standing on the porch, his hands in his pockets, his expression caught between hope and hesitation. Is this okay? He asked, his voice low. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The door closed behind him, the soft thud, a line drawn between the world outside and the one we shared. He moved into the living room, his presence filling the space, turning it into something new. I followed, my feet barely touching the ground, my breath a shallow rhythm in my chest. We sat on the edge of the couch, the same spot where we had shared that first real kiss. His hand found mine, his fingers slipping through mine, and I felt the weight of every moment that had led us here. His touch was warm, grounding me, pulling me into the present. I didn't pull away. His other hand rose, brushing against my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. I closed my eyes, the room narrowing to the point of contact, the world outside fading. His lips found mine, and this time there was no hesitation. His kiss was a question, and I answered, letting myself sink into the truth of it, the need that had woven itself into my bones. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, time slipping around us, the boundaries of reality bending. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, our breathing a shared rhythm. I felt his hands in my hair, his presence a warmth that filled every empty space inside me. I don't want to leave, he murmured, his voice a thread of sound in the quiet. I don't want you to, I replied, and it was the most honest thing I had said in weeks. We sat together as the light shifted, as the shadows moved across the room. There was no rush, no need to define what this was or what it could be. We existed in the in-between where time held its breath and the world outside waited. When he finally stood to go, I walked him to the door. He turned, his hand lingering on the doorknob, his expression a mirror of my own. He leaned in, a final kiss, soft and lingering, and then he was gone. The door closed, the house empty once more, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a void but a promise, a space filled with the echo of his touch and the possibility of what came next. I leaned against the door, my fingers pressed to my lips, and I knew that the line between us had vanished. There was no going back, no way to return to the life I had lived before. All that remained was the path forward into the unknown, where the story we had started continued to write itself, one moment at a time. The days that followed felt like living in a dream, a world painted in soft edges and muted colors. I moved through my life with a new awareness, each moment layered with the knowledge of him, the echo of his touch, the promise of his presence. My routine became a series of secret acts, coded messages, and whispered truths. Everything else fell away. The noise of everyday life dulled to a hum beneath the sharpness of what we had created. My husband remained oblivious, his days marked by the rhythm of his work, his evenings lost in the glow of his laptop. He would ask about my day, his voice warm, his eyes kind, but there was a distance between us, a shadow he could not see but that I felt with every breath. I found myself studying him, looking for signs of suspicion, a crack in the facade of our marriage. But he remained steady, his affection unchanged, and I felt the weight of my choices settle deeper into my bones. The messages from him came often, each one a small spark in the quiet of my day. He knew when my husband would be gone, his schedule as familiar to him as it was to me. We planned our moments carefully, weaving them into the fabric of my life, each visit a thread pulled tight, a secret seam hidden beneath the surface. Our meetings took on a rhythm of their own. He would arrive at my door, his knock soft, his presence filling the house with a warmth that lingered long after he had gone. We would sit together, our conversations dipping between the mundane and the profound. He spoke of his past, the broken pieces he carried, the hopes he had buried beneath the weight of his own regrets. I found solace in his honesty, a mirror to my own fractured reflection. One afternoon, as the light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, he told me about his dreams. "Sometimes I imagine a different life," he said, his voice a murmur against the quiet. "One where you're more than just a moment. Where I don't have to leave when the sun sets." His words settled over me, a blanket of possibility and ache. I reached for his hand, our fingers entwining, and felt the truth of it. I wanted that life too, the one where we could exist without the weight of secrets, where his name could slip from my lips without fear, where our moments were not stolen but freely given. But the reality of my life pressed against me, sharp and unyielding. I had built a world with my husband, a home filled with the echoes of years spent together. I could not untangle myself from it without breaking everything apart, without leaving pieces of myself behind. The thought terrified me, the idea of stepping into the unknown, of unraveling the carefully woven threads of my marriage. He saw it in my eyes, the hesitation, the pull between what I wanted and what I could not bear to lose. His expression softened, his thumb brushing over my knuckles, a silent understanding passing between us. "I won't ask you to choose," he whispered. "I know what this is. I need you to know how I feel." I pressed my forehead against his, our breath mingling, a shared moment of quiet. "I feel it too," I said, the words slipping from me, a truth I could not hold back. "But I don't know how to make this real. I don't know how to step into that life without losing everything." We sat there, wrapped in the stillness, the weight of our choices hanging in the air. His hand remained in mine, his touch a tether to the world we had created, a place where reality bent to our will. But as the shadows grew longer, the day folding into twilight, the edges of that world began to fray. The end came not with a confrontation or a dramatic revelation but with a slow, quiet unraveling. My husband, always perceptive in his own quiet way, began to notice the cracks. He asked if I was happy, his voice gentle, his eyes searching. I told him what he needed to hear, my smile practiced, my words a shield. But the truth hung between us, a thread pulled too tight, ready to snap. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen, the hum of the dishwasher filling the silence, he approached me. His hands rested on the counter, his posture open but cautious. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Like you're here but not really." The honesty of it cut through me, a blade of clarity. I turned to him, my own truth bubbling up, sharp and bitter. "I don't know where I am," I admitted. "I feel so lost." His expression shifted, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "Is there someone else?" The question hung in the air, a final thread, the edge of a cliff I had been walking along for months. I opened my mouth, the truth hovering on my tongue, but in the end I could not say it. "No," I said, the word a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward, touching everything. He nodded, his relief palpable, and I felt the weight of my lie settle over me, heavy and cold. He moved closer, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me into his warmth, but I felt nothing. The space between us remained, an unbridgeable distance carved by the choices I had made. When I saw him again, the truth lay between us, a shadow that neither of us could ignore. He reached for me, his hands gentle, his expression a mix of longing and acceptance. "This isn't real," I said, my voice breaking. "I want it to be, but it's not." His arms fell to his sides, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he replied, his voice a threadbare whisper. "I was just hoping." We stood there, our silence filled with everything we could not say. He turned, his figure a silhouette against the fading light, and walked away. The door closed behind him, a soft click that echoed through the empty house, a reminder of the world I had built and the one I had let slip through my fingers. In the end, it was not a choice but a surrender. I returned to my life, to the routines and the quiet, the walls of my marriage closing back around me. But in the quiet moments when the house lay still, I felt the ghost of him beside me, the warmth of his touch, the promise of a life I had only glimpsed but never truly held. And somewhere beneath the layers of everyday life, the spark remained, a quiet ember, a reminder of the story we had written in the margins, a truth that lived just beyond the edge of what could be.